Neo-Nazi groups, ISIS, QAnon. They may not seem to have much in common, but they all promise connection, community, purpose. Are those things in short supply today? And if so, are we living in a world that's more and more likely to produce extremists? Rundown producer Eric Bombacino tackles those questions and more with extremism researcher Amarnath Amarasingam.
I want to thank the delightful Amarnath Amarasingam for coming to hang out in our little dungeon here. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be back.
He is a professor in the School of Religion and is cross-appointed to the Department of Political Studies at Queen's University. So we're going to talk all things extremism today, but the first thing I wanted to start with is I think at the tippy top for folks, which is why? Why would someone pack their bags, fly to Syria and fight for ISIS? Why would someone join an extremist group? What's the allure or the appeal? What does it offer them? So let's start there. What's the first thing we should put on the table when it comes to understanding the appeal of extremism?
Well, I think a lot of people have grievances, right? They might have economic grievances, social grievances, cultural grievances, but not all of that will immediately translate to being part of an extremist group or even finding some of these groups attractive. I think that's where the ideology comes and does a little bit of work, right? What ideology does is it tends to interpret grievances for you, to answer a few pivotal questions. It's great that I'm struggling or something's happened to me economically, culturally, but who is responsible? What do I do about it? And what's required of me personally to do it, right? And so that ideology gives grievance sense of purpose, sense of meaning, and I think that's kind of at the base of it across different groups that we've all looked at. The Islamic State, Al Qaeda, the far right.
So there is this quest for meaning. That is one big part of this. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people say quest for meaning, but it's been said so many times that it sometimes feels like it's losing meaning.
What does it mean? Yeah.
But that is the fundamental driver for a lot of people, right? I think it is. You get to a point where just everyday occurrences in life aren't answering the more deeper questions in your life, and being part of these movements is very exciting, it's very revolutionary, very utopian, and so it does infuse kind of the boredom of everyday life with a sense of purpose, right? And that has to kind of be grounded in something that you're feeling in terms of grievances and loss. Otherwise, it tends to go nowhere. It has to be based in this idea that either my people's culture has been taken away, my people's rights have been taken away, socioeconomic damage has been done to me and my group, my in-group, and then all of that has to be reinterpreted with the use of ideology to kind of push people into some of these movements.
You also get a bunch of buddies. You get a ready-made community. Is that a big part of this? People are feeling lonely, and there's a need for community.
Community is huge. That can happen offline and online. I used to watch some of these ISIS supporters in the online space, and people always tended to dismiss the online community as less important than the real life community. And just watching them for a while, you tend to see that, they're willing to take risks for each other. Yeah. They're sending money to each other. They're doing, they have friendships. So that sense of online bonding is just as real as the offline bonding. And even that, though, is sometimes mediated by ideology, because who belongs in the in-group? Who is part of my community? Well, that's going to be determined by whether you agree with me or not, you're part of the in-group or not, right? There was a friend of mine whose son went off to fight in Syria and Iraq with the Islamic State, and she used to tell a story of how one day he would come home and say, I can no longer eat from your utensils. I can no longer eat from your plates because you are part of the polluted kind of non-believer family now. I'm part of the elect, the elite, the selected, the chosen. And so once you create those boundaries between us and them, that determines who your community is. Right. He's not just hanging out with anybody. He's hanging out with people who he thinks are equally saved, equally part of the in-group that he's a part of.
So to have that meaning and purpose, to have that solid sense of in-group community, does the out-group, the them, need to be like an existential threat?
Almost always.
Yes, okay.
Almost always has to be interpreted as an existential threat. J.M. Berger, who recently, a couple of years ago, wrote a book called Extremism, says that the extremism is dependent on the in-group feeling that it's very survival is at threat from the out-group.
Right.
Right, and so that dynamic is fundamental to extremism. Is to say that our very survival, our very success is determined on doing something to them because they're out to get us.
Okay.
Right, and so without that us and them framework, you just tend to kind of not have the same ideological intensity, I would say.
Isn't that lonely though? I know there is loneliness that can drive people to needing a sense of community. But if everyone around you, other than the people in your online space, is not just someone you can't relate to, but is a hardcore them that's an urgent threat to you, isn't that an oddly lonely existence?
Not really, because
Okay.
you're the saved vanguard of
Okay,
your
right.
own superhero movie. It's not a question of loneliness. It's a question of we are the minority saved elect who
Yeah.
then need to vanquish the other for our very survival, and that's justified because we are on the side of truth. I've had so many former extremists tell me that when they were deep in these movements, they felt they were heroes in a cosmic drama, right? And so it really galvanizes your sense of purpose, because you're not just fighting based on some boring policy disagreement. This is good versus evil, right? This is a cosmic struggle that I'm a part of it, and my people are on the side of good. So that's an enormous driver for
Yeah.
for being part of these groups. It's not simply that you disagree on immigration or you disagree on masking policy. It's that no, we're fighting for something way more important, and you're standing in the way.
That black and white thinking, I wanted to spend just a second on.
Yeah.
So I think it's fair to say the world's getting increasingly, dizzyingly complex. The gray area is getting grayer and grayer. And that can create a lot of uncertainty. That can create anxiety for folks. So does extremism in that black and white thinking, is that like a way out? Is extremism, and this may sound a little weird to say, but is extremism comforting?
I mean, I think the more the world gets complicated, German sociologist named Ulrich Beck used to call it the risk society, which is the idea that the world is getting so complicated that we don't even know what the parameters of these risks are, right? Like something can happen in Wuhan, China, and all of a sudden my kids in Toronto aren't going to school, right? There are no boundaries to current risks. Once you let it out of the bag, it's no putting it back in, and it kind of takes over, and it's all encompassing, and you don't know where the cause is. And so within that scenario, when an ideology or a group of people come in and say, we know this is all chaos, but actually let me explain why it's very simple, right? It's you are good and these people are bad, and they're the ones who caused this, and they're the ones you need to fight, right? It creates a very meaning out of that chaos and gives you a sense of purpose out of that chaos. And so that could be, so you can create those kind of in-groups out of that chaos, and this is where conspiracy theories are very useful, and this is where ideology is very useful, because those are the things that do the work of molding that chaos into something that you're not just a victim of, but now you can do something about it.
Control.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in times where there is greater uncertainty, which we just went through one for about 3 years, the pandemic, will you see a rise in conspiracy theory, these firm handholds to feel certain about something?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think all conspiracy theories, or conspiracy-linked extremist movements come out of some form of chaos.
Yeah.
Or some form of event that is beyond explanation, right? And academics call this proportionality bias, which is that when big things happen, we kind of desire psychologically a big cause for those big things.
Yeah.
Right. And when President of the United States gets assassinated, and you're like, well, it's just one guy in a book depository, that's not very satisfying.
Yeah.
Right. So, but it's more satisfying to say the CIA was behind it, or the USSR was behind it, or whatever. And so that similar dynamics happened with the pandemic, where it's just like, oh, the world came to a screeching halt,
Right.
and you're telling me because it was some lab experiment in the middle of nowhere, that doesn't make sense, right? And so actually we need
that's chaos. That's chaos.
We need a massively bigger, as big an explanation to explain the cause, and so I think, or explain the event, and so out of that, sometimes you do have conspiracy, because that's naturally conspiratorial thinking, right? And to say, who's behind all of this and why are they doing that? There's always this kind of shadowy elite who's out for chaos, who's controlling things. And you might think, well, that should make us more scared, but actually, at least you can identify.
Yes.
At least you can identify it, right? And that gives people a sense of comfort to say, okay, I know who's behind it, I know why they're behind it, and I know what I have to do. I have to wake everybody up to the truth, right? And so this kind of thinking was behind QAnon. The QAnon movement. This was behind a lot of the pandemic-related conspiracy theories, and so on. So this kind of pinpointing a cause and getting involved, and sometimes that naturally leads to extremist kind of movements because.
Right.
I always say not every conspiracy theory is the same. Not every conspiracy theory has a moral component to it in the same way.
As a call to action almost.
As a call to action. Whereas whereas QAnon was perfect for that, right? Whereas like Hollywood and the Democratic elite are operating a clandestine pedophile ring.
Right.
It's not the same as saying the Earth is flat or the moon landing was faked, because this one has a moral call to action. You're telling me kids are being enslaved and tortured. That's going to get me out of my seat much more likely than the moon landing was faked or the Earth is flat or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So not all conspiracy theories can galvanize in the same way, and I think we've seen more and more the nature of those conspiracy theories shift to those that are galvanizing.
You had an ex-QAnon member in your classroom at Queen's a little while ago, and I think one of your students said afterwards that, this guy is really empathetic.
Yeah.
How so?
Well, I mean, hearing him talk and hearing a lot of other people who've left these movements talk, it's kind of what I was saying earlier. It's just like, I felt like I had to wake up everyone around me. They weren't hip to the truth. They were asleep at the wheel. In the meantime, there's all this evil happening underneath the surface, which I became privy to and that I could see and other people weren't seeing. And so I needed to wake up everybody around me to go help these children, right? And so we need to go help these children. And it was a kind of it was a deeply empathetic moment for him. He felt helpless. He felt like he wasn't doing what he could and what he should be doing. Wasn't doing enough. And so it's a deeply empathetic stance. It just happens to be based on a belief that doesn't make any sense and is not true.
Right.
I used to do like training with some Canadian military folks, and whenever I would go down, all of the ISIS fighters who'd gone overseas to join ISIS or join other militant groups in the context of the Syrian civil war, millions of refugees, hundreds of thousands dead. Some of them would put up their hand and say, "This sounds a lot like why I joined the military," right? And I was always like, "I'm glad you said it and not me," but but at the same time, they'd captured a core personal part of it, which is you want to go do good, right? You want to go and help people who are struggling and suffering. So one of them joined a legal pro-social Canadian military. The others joined a listed terrorist entity, sure, but they recognize that at the core, the moral thrust of it was very similar.
Okay, so I wanted to ask a big and unfair question. And it's sort of looking at, I think we've been nibbling at it a little bit, but it's that I think it's really been, you and I have been talking about this for over a decade. I used to, as a nervous young producer on The Agenda, I would call you up. I think de-radicalization programs funded by the federal government have been around for just over a decade now. In that sweep of 10 years, in terms of those conditions we're talking about, the need for meaning, the need for purpose, loneliness, the need for community, are we now in a world that is more and more likely to create and produce extremists?
That's a good question. It is a bit of an unfair question. You're right.
I fairly set it up as unfair, which I think is fair.
I think we are at a situation. This is kind of very bird's eye in a way. Like what I've been seeing across some of these movements is what some researchers now call like the end of modernity. Means like modernity has kind of run its course. In other words, the promise of modernity is you're going to be middle class. You're going to have a nice house with a picket fence and a car and a wife and a child. Wife and children, and everything's going to be great. It's going to be peaceful. There's not going to be any war. It's going to be a peaceful transfer of power. you're going to have a pension. Like that was the promise of liberal modernity, is to say we're going to make your life chaos free, right? But what I think we're seeing now is the limits of that, which is the sense of flair, purpose, meaning is all lost, and so you have a lot of people are fine with the white picket fence story, right? They're happy in it, but there are individuals who find that strips life of purpose and meaning, and that you need to kind of go beyond it to find a purpose for yourself, right? And so that, I think, when you say, are we in a situation where you might create more extremist movements, when that calmness of modernity runs its course, or there are moments that pierce it, like the pandemic, which kind of upended our sense of normalcy, or what you're seeing in the United States right now, which is all of the wallpaper institutions of their life are being eroded, and people are realizing that, oh, I thought we didn't need these things. Because liberal modernity, what it does is it functions very smoothly, right? It's boring, it's bureaucratic, it's institutional, it'll give you whatever you want. And what it does is it creates a kind of wallpaper around yourself to the point where you don't actually remember that you need these things, right? And so you start to take it for granted. You start to take the peace and serenity for granted. And you need a kind of Trump figure once in a while to be like, let me take away your healthcare for a bit. Let me send in the military and border agents to come just show up at your daycare. Let me talk about stealing elections and stuff like that. And then people say, oh, the wallpaper our lives, that all that stuff we took for granted, we actually need all that. Right? And the way extremist movements come into that scenario is you need an explanation for why there's renewed chaos in why, right? And so extremist groups will be very good at explaining to you where this chaos came from, who's to blame,
Right.
and what you need to do about it. And so when that kind of peaceful setup ends, there's an opportunity there for violence and chaos, and extremist groups love violence and chaos.
So there's a real feedback loop here.
Of course, and so I think what you're seeing now in the U.S. is a good example of this. I always tell my students, from the time you wake up in the morning, you walk through maybe 1,000 institutions of trust that you have no idea about, right? The ones that are keeping your toothpaste from being poisonous, the ones that kept your Eggo waffles from being poisonous. There's people in cubicles all around the world who are doing that job for you so that you can just walk to school, right? But when you have a RFK Jr. in there, or when you have these individuals who kind of disrupt that sense of normalcy and clean functioning, you get a little shock to the system, right? It's like, oh, now what's in my food and what am I drinking? And that's what creates a lot of uneasiness and chaos that people aren't used to, especially in the West. Because liberal modernity, that's all it was good at. It was keeping it predictable and boring.
Right.
And then when you throw that for a loop, it becomes a potential for conspiracy theories, extremist movements, to kind of take advantage of that, I think.
So let's quote George Orwell. I think it's always good to quote George Orwell.
Yeah.
We're talking about 2026, but let's go back about, 86 years. This is from Orwell's review of a book called Mein Kampf. And I think it's a weird way of setting that up. I think it really gets at what you're talking about here. So the fact is, Orwell writes, that there is something deeply appealing about him. Hitler knows that human beings don't only want comfort, safety, short working hours, hygiene, birth control, and in general, common sense. They also, at least intermittently, want struggle and self-sacrifice, not to mention drums, flags, and loyalty parades. However they may be as economic theories, fascism and Nazism are psychologically far sounder than any hedonistic conception of life. This was 85 years ago. So has there always been this kind of defect at the heart of liberalism that's maybe both a strength and a weakness, where liberalism doesn't come packaged with any meaning for you? It is a container. It's a container for people to have freedom of religion in.
Yeah. I forget who said this, but there was something like liberalism will tell you how to live, but it doesn't tell you what you're living for. And that, I think, is at the heart of that quote too, right? It's like, if you're happy with normalcy, liberalism will give you normalcy. But once in a while, if you need the pageantry, if you need the charismatic leader, if you need someone hitting their chute at the podium, that's not what liberalism will do. It'll give you the peaceful transfer of very boring power over decades and make sure that no one invades you, and and it'll be nice and quiet. But there are people, and I've heard them on TV now with the Trump administration, in other parts of the world too, where you do need. There is a thirst for kind of a charismatic leader who bursts through that boredom and gives you some kind of touches your spirit in a way that's more than just this kind of institutional boredom.
Yeah.
Right? Even if it's very peaceful and things are quiet and stable, once in a while people thrive on not chaos but something greater than themselves to feel like they're human.
But why now then? Why is this defect becoming more obvious now?
I mean, that's tough to say. I mean, I think it is an entirely different media landscape and information landscape that we live in now, and it's hard to pinpoint where that sense of need is coming from. There's a lot more things to be pissed off about for people because they're encountering and consuming a lot more grievances from other parts of the world and other communities which we wouldn't have had any access to before social media in particular. So I do think that that's driving a lot of angst and getting people riled up that way. Misinformation. They're consuming a lot of information that they wouldn't have in the past, and so that's part of it.
I think maybe we got to put loneliness on the table for a second too. I mean, the United Kingdom created a minister of loneliness, which kind of sounds like a Monty Python bit, but it's a real thing. It's premised on this idea that loneliness is a public health issue. Loneliness can kill. It's terrible for your physical health. I guess what I'm curious here is, should we also see loneliness as terrible for our political health? The lonelier we get, the more atomized we get, the less community we feel that we're bounded in around us. Are we going to start to see more and more things that I guess hack away at the stuff that makes democracy work?
I think so. I mean, on the one hand, it's self-destructive. So we might just see a generation of young people kind of whittle away by themselves. Then you can see the opposite reaction, which is they join very intense communities as a way to feel like they belong. So, like whenever I've talked to former members of the far right and former neo-Nazis and stuff like that, they always bring that part in, which is I was bullied at school. I felt alone, and I felt attacked. And these guys made me feel strong and safe and powerful. And so that's a natural response, I think, to that sense of loneliness. So there are others who might turn that loneliness in a self-destructive way, and you're seeing that a bit with the incel community. At least the kind of more what they call black-pilled corner of the incel community, which they feel like everything's doomed and there's no point in being alive. But the loneliness can lead in either of those directions, right? Or it can lead pro-socially, where you join a bowling league or whatever and and get back out there and do something in society. But I do think with the amount of hours people are working, having our face in our phones the whole time, there's this kind of veneer of being attached to things that are going on, but it's actually a very lonely experience, right? You can be an online profile with 100,000 followers and have a YouTube channel and all that, but you're still in your bedroom by yourself.
Yeah.
Right, and so it does create this feeling of being like you're out there, but actually we're just all on our individual devices. That's the core of a lot of the problems that we're seeing, and so that can go pro-social or that can go sideways.
All right, one more question on liberalism. I promise, no more after this. I think we're starting to see politics becoming a little bit religious for people. Politics as religion. Does liberalism need religion in general that contains that need for meaning without it becoming politics as religion?
I mean, liberalism doesn't need religion, but what it tends to do sometimes is create civil religion, right? And so again, to name drop some more, Robert Bella wrote this very important article back in whenever it was, called Civil Religion, where he says America, even though it presumes to not be a religious country, like a state's religious country, religious freedom, etc., does have a lot of religious qualities to its patriotism, right? There's In God We Trust on the currency, there's flags, there's 21 gun salutes. There's the worship of the Second Amendment in the Constitution and all of these things. There's a kind of civil religious component to it, which the practice of politics in the United States is itself a kind of religious impulse, right? And I don't know that any other country really has that, except maybe like Hindu nationalism in India, or where some of that has been fused together. But the U.S. has always been kind of peculiar for that, which is the kind of commitment that they have to their own founding, the way they talk about their founding fathers or the founding documents. And there's a kind of reverence there, which to secular figures that doesn't sometimes get replicated in other countries. So that can happen sometimes with liberalism, where the kind of state itself is sacralized. But it doesn't necessarily require like religion unless that kind of thing happens.
Is it good in Canada that we don't have that relationship with our founding and past? Because there are some people I know that would be like, they want us to have more of that relationship. They want us to be more rooted in that history.
Well, this is the challenge, right? Is like we're a multicultural, pluralist society, and whenever political leaders are asked what our Canadian identity is, they say our Canadian identity is multiculturalism. And that's great for some people who, like me, who arrived here during the height of multiculturalism. But if you're kind of nativist oriented, if you're, if you again have these grievances that something about Canada is being disappeared and taken away from you, that's not good enough, right? Pluralism as an identity isn't good enough because it's not giving you a sense of truth. It's 100 people who believe 100 different things. You're saying I should find value in that diversity. Well, what about like what I thought Canada stood for, and it's disappearing, and people aren't assimilating, and they're bringing their worldviews in here. Something's being eroded, and we need to reclaim it, right? And so it can lead. I think we're seeing a reaction to pluralism and multiculturalism, or the lack of sophistication around it from some of these more nativist groups or far right groups. That there's something at the core of Canadian identity which is being lost.
Obviously, that conversation is not over. Tune in next week for part 2 of our discussion with Amarnath Amarasingam when we talk about a new form of extremism that's baffling researchers.